According to all aerodynamic laws, the bumblebee cannot fly because its body weight is not in the right proportion to its wingspan. But ignoring these laws, the bee flies anyway.
Granted, this unfortunately turned out to be a misconception, as the dynamics of insect flight were entirely misunderstood by the engineers of the 1930s, and the bee, of course, was always perfectly obeying the laws of nature. Nonetheless, it remains such a beautiful image of endurance, or what I find better defined as the struggle to continue against a mounting desire to stop. There is a profound resonance in this imagery, because it accurately mirrors the internal reality of the modern human condition. To exist in the current era is to feel structurally unfit for the atmosphere one is forced to navigate. We wake up to a heavy friction, a sense that the world expects us to fly through seamlessly, while we are secretly held together by sheer willpower. We look at our old expectations that fell behind, our burnt out minds, and the background noise of a world that feels perpetually on the brink, yet doesn't seem to care for us as much as we wish it did. And we realize we aren't just trying to make it through the day, we are all trying to figure out how to live while actively falling apart. The mistake we make is treating life like a repair project. We tell ourselves constantly that once we fix the anxiety, once we cure the loneliness, or once the hardships finally pass, then we will begin living the way we're meant to be. But what if these hardships are but a feature of the terrain? An entire philosophical framework for surviving this collapse was born in the early 3rd century BC, when a wealthy Phoenician merchant was transporting a fortune in purple dye across the Mediterranean. A violent storm hit, tearing his ship apart and swallowing his entire livelihood into the sea. Zeno washed ashore in Athens, utterly ruined, completely stripped of his identity and his future, wandering the streets as a suddenly impoverished castaway. He stumbled into a bookshop, read about the teachings of Socrates, and eventually began lecturing on a public painted Porsche, the Stoa Poikili. Out of the absolute destruction of his life, Stoicism was formed. Zeno recognized at that moment that fortune takes whatever it pleases, whenever it pleases, so a person must build a fortress within the mind that fortune cannot reach. Centuries later, this same desperate need for internal stability found its way to a military tent near the frozen Danube River, where a man was riding to himself in the dead of the night. He was the most powerful person on earth at the time, the Emperor of Rome, but his empire was being ravaged by a deadly plague. His borders were under attack, and his closest friends were betraying him. But Marcus Aurelius didn't write to complain, nor did he write a manifesto on how to fix the world. He wrote what we now call meditations, essentially a diary of a man trying to keep his soul from cracking under the weight of existence. He, along with a former slave named Epictetus and a wealthy playwright named Seneca, practiced this same philosophy born from Zeno's shipwreck. In fact, Epictetus understood the burden of existence more intimately than most, having spent his youth at the mercy of a uniquely brutal man who, in a fit of blind rage, began twisting his leg. But he didn't beg for mercy, nor did he scream at the injustice of the universe. He calmly looked at his master and warned, "You are going to break it." When the bone finally snapped, Epictetus simply observed, "I told you it would break." He spent the rest of his life walking with a severe limp, navigating the world with a permanently damaged body, yet he became one of the most brilliant philosophical minds in history, precisely because he realized that while a master could chain his leg, no one could chain his mind. True Stoicism served as a survival strategy for people who felt entirely too much. Far from the modern caricature of emotional repression, it functioned as the art of finding a quiet room inside your own mind while the house burned down around you. At the absolute core of this mindset is a distinction so simple it almost sounds insulting: the dichotomy of control. Epictetus argued that the world is divided into two neat columns. In the first column are the things up to us, our opinions, our desires, our choices, and our reactions. In the second column is, well, everything else. The weather, the economy, the behavior of other people, sickness, and the inevitable chaotic turns of fate. We spend 90% of our emotional energy screaming at the second column. We treat the uncontrollable elements of life as personal insult. When a hardship hits, whether it's a sudden loss, a failing relationship, or just the heavy, inexplicable depression that ruins a random day for no good reason, our immediate instinct is to fight it, to demand of the universe why such misery was assigned to us. Why me, we say. But the Stoics see caring about the uncontrollable as nothing more than a form of self-inflicted madness. It is like getting furious at the rain for wetting your clothes. Seneca took this a step further, suggesting that our suffering comes from a fundamental misunderstanding of ownership. We believe we own our health, our relationships, and our peace of mind. Seneca argued that we own absolutely nothing. Everything we have is merely borrowed from fortune. When life falls apart, we are not losing anything of our own. We are simply returning what was temporarily loaned to us by the universe. Writing to a friend who's drowning in grief, Seneca dropped his most ferocious, counterintuitive lines. What need is there to weep over parts of life? The whole of it calls for tears. New miseries assail us before we have freed ourselves from the old ones. It sounds on first reading like absolute despair, but it is the exact opposite. What Seneca was saying is that the expectation of a life without suffering is itself the source of our deepest agony. It is the suffering that comes from believing a given difficulty is an aberration, a mistake, a thing that shouldn't be happening. Once that false expectation is given up, our response to misfortune changes completely. A misfortune that was always mathematically possible doesn't require weeping over, it requires a response. When you internalize this, a strange, almost absurd peace takes over. You stop asking the world to stop shaking and instead you focus entirely on your own footing. You look at the crisis in front of you and recognize your complete inability to alter its arrival. You declare the external chaos to be simply outside your jurisdiction. This realization acts as the ultimate conservation of energy. It demands that when your life is falling apart, you conserve every drop of your limited strength rather than raging against the gravity of the fall. You shift your gaze inward. You ask yourself what small immediate thing remains within your grasp. It might just be the next breath. It might be choosing not to lash out at someone else. It might be the decision to treat yourself with a cold, clear-eyed kindness, even while everything else crumbles before you. Endurance then changes its definition. It ceases to be this grueling, miserable match where you grit your teeth and white-knuckle your way through the pain. Endurance becomes an act of radical surrender, a willing embrace of reality exactly as it is, rather than how you desperately wish it were. But make no mistake, none of this is an argument for indifference or passivity. The Stoics were not people who folded their hands and waited. They were people who acted with everything they had while remaining somewhere beneath the action, unmoved by whether it produced the desired result. What this philosophy gives is the capacity to function at full force without tying the meaning of that function to whether the circumstances cooperated. There's a profound dignity in looking at an unfair world and refusing to let it dictate how you must react. You recognize that the external world can break your bones, it can drain your bank account, and it can break your heart, but it cannot force you to lose your mind unless you hand over the keys for it. You begin to understand that peace is never found by waiting for the tragedy to end or by desperately trying to glue the broken pieces of your life back into their original shape. Real peace is the defined decision to make a home within the ruins. You stop waiting for a flawless life and you start living fully and intentionally right in the middle of the wreckage. Memento mori sits underneath all of this, the Stoic practice of keeping death present as an orientation, the awareness that the time available is finite, that each day carries a cost, whether spent or wasted, that the person who is putting off the difficult work until conditions improve is making a bet against the only resource that cannot be recovered. Seneca again, in a different letter, said, "They lose the day in expectation of the night, and the night in the fear of the dawn." The person who is waiting to be stable before beginning, waiting to feel ready before committing, waiting for the circumstances to be more favorable before deciding to show up fully, that person is doing something precise. They are spending time, which is the only currency that matters, on a transaction that will never close. We spend so much time terrified of the shipwreck that will sink our carefully laid plans. We frantically try to hold all the fragile, mismatched pieces of our lives together. Perhaps the ultimate freedom lies in letting the die sink to the bottom of the sea. Zeno said he made a prosperous voyage when his ship went down. He meant that before the shipwreck, he was carrying the wrong cargo. He didn't know it yet because the ship was still afloat. What the sea took from him was everything he'd been using to avoid the question of what he was actually for. And in the absence of that, standing in a bookshop with nothing, he found the thing that no wreck could subsequently reach. The Stoics would say that that thing had always been there. They would say it is always there. The only question is what it takes for a person to find it.